Disruptors and curious minds, CEOs, founders, book lovers. Welcome to the Thinking on Paper Book Club. I'm Mark. This is Jeremy, and we read books that have stood the test of time, books that will change your mind. You've heard of slow food. This is slow reading, one book, one chapter, 1 week. If you're new to this, book club is the second pillar in the Thinking on Paper framework, a better, more holistic understanding of the impact of on emerging technologies on business and culture. Thinking on paper.xyz for more. So we're reading chapter 5 of Nexus this week, and we're going to be talking about the difference between democracy and totalitarianism, how they are formed by information networks, how the flow of information changes the regime and how they can flourish. We'll be examining the whole spectrum, and we're meeting some very nefarious, horrible characters along the way, won't we, Jeremy? Nero, Sparta, the Soviet Union, the strongmen, Putin, Orban, Erdogan, all of them. It's going to be brilliant. First impressions, Jeremy, before we get to that.
First impression is just a commitment to my no jacket required engagement with books. First impressions on this, man. Yeah, it starts out we're basically bouncing between democracy and totalitarianism, right? And so
Yep.
you have these two. If we break it down to how information is sent, right? You could send information in multiple ways, just like we're doing right now. This is a broadcast, right? This is a broadcast. It's going from us to one person. It's not a bi-directional yet, but if you guys send us a link and you're listening and you want to participate, we can turn this this broadcast into a bi-directional thing. So a democracy is a conversation, right?
Right.
And totalitarianism is more broadcast. So maybe we can do it a different way. Mark, me talking to you and you talking to me, that's democracy. You telling me something and me having no choice over it is totalitarianism.
Yeah. So that's the main difference. Is he outlies the differences. Yeah. Centralized totalitarianism is a centralized flow of data. Democracy is decentralized. It uses the word nodes. It's kind of spread out. I think the big key is that totalitarianism has no self-correcting mechanisms, whereas democracy is based heavily on self-correcting mechanisms, which we've spoken about self-correcting mechanisms in the past, haven't we? The law, the court, the media, education, those kind of things, where we're all fallible, aren't we? And these correct that fallibleness. But you have the totalitarian systems, there is no, the center is infallible, and they're the main differences between those two. And then he kind of lays out how you get there, doesn't he? So yeah, what's your favorite totalitarianist?
Well, geez, I mean, well, first of all, one of the quotes that popped out that I thought was really interesting is about elections, right? And dictatorships have elections, and you're like, how the hell is this dictatorship having what does an election mean in there, right? So elections are not a method for discovering truth. They are a method to maintain order. So, right, less truth, more order, more truth, less order. We got to remember that like little seesaw thing there. And what's really interesting? We're a week away from the inauguration here in the States, right? And not a week away. We're like a couple days
Monday.
away.
Yeah,
It's Monday.
we're recording this on the 17th of January.
I try not to think about it, Mark, to tell you the truth. But what's really interesting is he talks about, Harari talks about in the book about how to flip democracy. And, like almost like this playbook on how to flip democracy. And he says flipping democracy starts with taking over its self-correcting mechanisms. Okay. And as you mentioned before, self-correcting mechanisms are the courts, are the media. And this particular individual that's reassuming office in a few days has pretty good control over the courts. And I don't know about the media, but I think he created his own media. So it's really interesting to read this and kind of go, wait, is he dusting off an old playbook? Like, what's happening here?
Well, so in the book, in chapter 5, he speaks about populism, doesn't he? And I think that's the kind of the middle ground between democracy and dictatorship, and once, in a well-functioning democracy, citizens trust the results of elections, the decisions of courts, the reports of media outlets, and the findings of scientific disciplines, because citizens believe these institutions are committed to the truth. Once people think that power is the only reality, they lose trust in all these institutions, democracy collapses, and the strong man can seize total power.
Exactly, and here's the irony of all of this, Mark. Populism, according to the book, according to the author and his examples, starts with this telling of, hey, we shouldn't trust all these elites and all of these institutions and all of that. Don't trust any of these things, Mark, but I know who you should trust. You should trust me. And don't trust them. You shouldn't trust any one thing, but trust the one thing that is me, which is really an interesting, because I know better. I know what's best for you.
Yeah, the above the power structure lies with the will of the people, isn't it? And it doesn't matter how many people take up arms and try and defend that, it always comes out as the will of the people. I think it's very important to mention the spectrum. So it's not a binary sum game, is it? Democracy and dictatorship aren't binary opposites, but rather are on a continuum. To decide whether a network is closer to the democratic or the dictatorial end of the continuum, we need to understand how information flows in the network and what shapes the political conversation. I think we all know what democracy is in general. I think we all know what totalitarianism in general. This chapter, it's playing a difficult balancing game, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he's trying to explain the very basics of democracy, but on the other hand, he's trying to expand on how it comes about. And I think that as a writer, that's a fine, like, you got to know your audience, because you got to know your readership, don't you? Because sometimes I felt like he was saying very obvious things, and then other times when he goes into the historical details, it was a bit more eye-opening, and I quite enjoyed that aspect of the chapter.
That's the tricky part. It's like, coaching a group of players. Some players are highly skilled, some players are new, some players are in the middle. As a writer, you got to kind of, give something to pull all of those different skill sets along the journey. So you talked about this continuum, this spectrum, and it's all based on how information flows within these systems, which is really interesting, right?
Yeah.
So the dictatorship is kind of flows from this central point and out as a broadcast, and it's all processed centrally, right? But here's an interesting piece about democracy. They talk about democracy as a conversation, right,
Yeah.
between two nodes in the network. Let's talk about, these are information networks, right? These are two nodes in a network talking. But even when you have the ability to talk in a democracy, what happens when you don't have the will to listen?
Well, democracy fails. That was the other point of it. That's the other way that democracy can fail. It's when the conversation becomes one way. Um, Nobody's listening.
Not because of the inability of the network and the system to function as like an infrastructure, but the ability for the human side to use the infrastructure as designed. It's an important thing to think about, I think.
It is, and a lot of this is important to think about. Like you say, 3 days away from Inauguration Day, and I forgot to mention at the beginning that what me and Jeremy are going to try to do at the end of this is assimilate chapter 5 into what it means in the age of artificial intelligence, because
Whew.
the whole book
Yeah.
is about that. And it's artificial intelligence is about the flow of information. So in some way, we're going to try and connect democracy and totalitarianism to what happens next with artificial intelligence. So stay tuned for that.
Let's
So
do Oh, I was
there
just
you
gonna say,
go.
let's jump in a time machine. Let's
Let's
get
jump in
in
a
like
time
the
machine.
let's
Okay.
jump in the time machine, and let's go back and look at Athens and Rome. Let's go look at how those organizations dealt with scale, because I think infrastructure is designed based on how things scale, and things like
Okay, then. So get back in your time machine and go a little bit further, and we'll go to
okay,
the hunter gatherers first, and
okay,
just
let's start there.
let's start at the beginning, where democracy in the very early hunter gatherer period of humanity, that democracy flourished, kind of. And why did it flourish? Because small, manageable groups of people, where any kind of dictatorial delusions of grandeur would be quickly put out, wouldn't they? There's a communication amongst the small group. The group would decide what to eat, who to hunt, whether to go rampaging around and kill everybody in the next community. Like, it was all a group decision, wasn't it?
Maybe, or it's one person holding this group hostage per se by manipulating their desire for security and their fear of not having it.
Do you think that happened though in those hunter gatherer times?
Well, imagine you're in a group and you have like 20 or 30 people, you're well fed, you're maybe dare I say cultured, you have nice houses that protect you from the cold. And I'm this dude just kind of walking around in the perimeter doing my own thing. I'm fending off like threats. I'm like maybe eating once or twice a week. And from my perch high on the mountain, I'm looking down at your little organization, you have fires and you're dancing. And I'm like, man, that would be kind of awesome. Like it kind of sucks out here by myself. I should probably run down and see what they're up to. And I get down there and you welcome me in. You're like, hey, this is great. Come on in. But you're also like, yo, you have to shave your mustache. You can't call me by anything other than your highness. You're not allowed to wear shoes on Wednesday. But I'm like, you know what? Food, shelter, all that stuff is worth me making those sacrifices under your control.
That's later though, isn't it? That's like, well, Mesopotamia and ancient Greece. I think right back in the hunter gatherers, that wasn't a possibility. But yeah, once the agricultural revolution came about and writing became a thing, then yes, exactly what you described became possible, didn't it? They controlled. You could control the crops. You could control to a certain degree the financial systems of those places and times.
So with a technology, meaning like with a means to exert your will or control over something, right? That's valuable, right? And that becomes valuable, makes you valuable. You're the guy that figured it out. People kind of trust you and kind of get pulled into your ecosystem. I want to talk about scale though. Like
Yes.
let's talk about scale. Um, so Rome Rome had two elected consuls checked by the Senate, checked by something else called tribunes. So how the heck did they end up with an unelected emperor? It's really interesting, but he argues or he presents the point that they had 75 million people distributed over 5 million kilometers squared, and only 10 to 20% of them could read. So it's hard to have a conversation when you're that far apart, right? And when people aren't even able to converse necessarily. So it had to become something different, didn't it? Like the democracy in that case couldn't officially scale, right?
Yeah, it's like an autocratic center. What did he say? As the size of polities continued to increase and city states were superseded by large kingdoms, even partial democracy disappeared. All the examples of ancient democracies are city state. We don't know of any large scale kingdom or empire that operated along democratic lines for the reasons that you say. Yeah. We just, and that was to do with the technology. It wasn't possible. I mean, Nero would have loved to manipulate and know and control and corral everyone, wouldn't he? But the technology wasn't there, and so I guess they knew that they couldn't do that, so they were happy to kind of have the power and the money and the taxes that they had, rather than seeking this totalitarianism which came later.
The E word came up again. I'm not talking about the one that melted our faces during Carlo Rovelli's book about entropy. I'm talking about empathy, which ironically we talked about a lot in the debrief of our last show with the technical prize director for quantum computing for X Prize.
Awesome show.
Awesome show. Like that was so much fun. But you know, the idea of empathy being a required ingredient for large scale political conversations is really interesting because right now there's a lack of empathy in large scale political conversations, but he defines meaningful discourse in here, which is something I've always wanted to like think about. Like, how do you define meaningful interaction? How do you define meaningful discourse between two people, right? And he says you have to have proximity. So right now we have proximity, Mark. You and I we're connected on a largely unlaggy uh, uh, stream here,
What are you
but
trying to say?
yeah, it's a little jabbery. Um, and intimate knowledge, right? So intimate knowledge of like, I know you, you know me, don't sing the Barney song. But we also have intimate knowledge of the topics, right? Of the topics of discussion, right? So we can have meaningful discourse. Let's not have meaningful
Okay.
intercourse. Let's have
Careful,
meaningful
Jeremy.
discourse. Um,
I know it's Friday, but come on.
because we have proximity and intimate knowledge. I think that was an equation for something undefinable. That's really interesting to me.
I agree. Do you think, just before we get back onto kind of mass media and what happened after ancient Rome, but they gave up, didn't they? In ancient Rome, they kind of wanted democracy. They understood what it was about, but they just like, oh, we can't do it. It's too big. We've invaded too many lands. What are the Brits doing? What are the Gauls doing? Who cares? Like, we can't do it. Let's just go down. Let's get Caesar in control and go down the other path. How do you think people feel about being governed?
I
And do
mean,
you think that people in ancient times had a different view of being governed? Do you think we've learned, kind of like Pavlov's dog, to like or not like being governed?
man, I whenever I'm asked a question like this, and I don't know if you do this as well, because we've talked about our Thrasher magazine and skate culture and punk rock music, and just the idea of like someone telling you you have to do something, right? And immediately, there's a resistance to be like, hey, I want to do this thing myself. But like he references in previous chapters, there's a place for this bureaucracy. There's a place for these rules and this organization and this standard to kind of live and work by. So it's a balance, right? Like, where is the balance of giving people, like, it's almost like we're sitting in a jazz jam, right? And if we're getting ready to play together, we've never played together. I'm going to say, hey, we're going to play in C, Mark. And you're going to be like, okay, well, I know that there's a rule that helps us, instead of just like clamoring around. We got to have a little bit of organization. Don't you think? Like, do you struggle with that too? How do you think about that?
In a very similar way, yeah. And on a personal level, yeah. Yeah, but we're all different, aren't we? So some people like to be told what to do. Some people like to have other people putting all the structure in it. Some people like a much more hands-off approach. I guess it depends. And I was just kind of thinking aloud about how that's changed over the thousands of years. Um, Pompeii. I've got Pompeii written down here. I was just thinking about the Pompeii bit. So you talk about scale. You talk about the Romans, ancient Rome, Greece, and then I was reminded again how, in the grand scheme of things, how everything's really happened in the last 100, 200 years, hasn't it? Before the invention. I mean, at one point he talks about pamphlets, like this great technological marvel, a pamphlet. And actually the pamphlet kind of, because of its ease before the book became kind of universal, it was this changed the flow of information. And a pamphlet, I think it was talking about Poland and Lithuania, or the Dutch experiments, like the Netherlands that we know now, that was kind of founded on pamphlets. And that obviously that quickly comes to newspapers, and he talks about America and the Civil War, and how you know your American history better than I do, but they're talking about what was it? Oh gosh, I've written it down. I was going to ask you a question about American history, Jeremy.
Well, while you're looking for that, yeah, let's move to the U.S. Right. So he talked about the two first experiments in democracy, this Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth that to some extent worked, but was missing that vehicle to communicate over long distance. Then you talked about the pamphlet. newspaper, the Dutch Republic, was really the one experiment
Yeah.
that kind of said, "Hey, here's a newspaper. Here's we're gonna distribute the news." It's the WhatsApp of like the early days, right?
Yeah.
And then the U.S. is kind of peeking around, like, what do we do what kind of system do we put in place? Hey, these Dutch guys have something going on. Like, let's talk about that and how we can base our systems around that. But here's something I thought was really interesting. Just like any technology when it first comes out, like the Apple Vision Pro when it first came out was like $3,500 or $4,000. Like, who the hell is gonna, you know, just rip off 4 grand and go do that, right? But newspapers back in the day, subscriptions were actually pretty expensive. It was like more than 1 week's wages for most skilled workers, according to what Harari says in here.
Well, yeah, that's the spectrum of democracy again, isn't it? So America, back in the time of the Gettysburg Address, I mean, it was only rich white men who were allowed to vote. So in today, compared to today's democracy, it wasn't very democratic, but compared to everybody else and everywhere else in the world, it was very democratic. So on that spectrum, you get more freedoms in your democracy back then, thanks to the newspaper. It was the
Well,
Gettysburg Address, by the way. Could you explain what the Gettysburg Address was, Jeremy?
4 score and 7
Was
years
that?
ago.
Okay.
I don't know. Could be wrong. No, here's an interesting fact that I pulled out of here too. In 1830, there were only 78,000 newspaper subscriptions in the US in 1830. And largely, like you said, that's the domain of wealthy white men who could afford that, right? So you have this available technology, but then accessibility to that technology is super limited, right? So it's only for the participation in democracy is limited by your ability to access the available technology. To tie into that a little bit more, you referenced the elections. In the 1824 elections, 7% of the total population made use of their right to vote. 7%. And Adams won the vote with 2%. 2% of that 7%. That's like, it's like, is that a democracy? And then he also says at
Yes.
the time, yes, one variation of democracy, yes, but at the time, there were more slaves in the United States than voters. 1.5 million slaves to 352,780 voters. I don't
Yeah, but
know that that
don't
count.
don't don't forget that he says, and he says it quite a few times, that democracy isn't voting. It isn't just the
True,
vote. It's the
true.
self-correcting mechanisms and the way to question the fallibility of the center. So it's not just the elections. It's and yeah, as North Korea demonstrate with their democratic elections every 5 years or whatever
Yeah,
they
look,
do.
it's a ballot. We're going to put it in
Oh,
the
look,
box.
Ding Jong-un, he won
Yeah,
again, 99% of the vote. Whoa, what a guy!
right.
So, but yes, compared to today, that's a very tiny fraction.
Okay, should we can are you okay to flip to Stalin? Is that too far to jump ahead or where do you want to
No,
go?
okay. So on that Stalin bit, I'm going to say the telegraph, the telephone, the television, the radio, the train, the plane. These were the way that information flowed very quickly. Technology expanded from the pamphlet, yeah, the telegraph, telephone, later television, before that radio, train, plane, and a quote: "Mass media made democracy possible, not inevitable." Mass media made democracy possible, not inevitable. And I think that when we talk about AI later is we should hold on to that. But yeah, and then so that lays the way for a very dark time.
Yeah, so say that quote again about democracy that doesn't guarantee mass media doesn't guarantee democracy is basically what you were saying,
Yeah,
right?
mass media made democracy possible, not inevitable.
Yeah, so yeah, does it is mass media a broadcast or is it a conversation, right? And I think you go back to that little rule, that little heuristic, if you will, that maybe can lead us to believe it's one way or the other. Stalin must have been freaking exhausted, dude. I'm telling you, like, listen to this quote right here. Attempt to control totalitarianism, an attempt to control what every person throughout the country is doing and saying at every moment of the day, and potentially what every person is thinking and feeling. Like, I can't imagine I can't imagine like trying to do that and stressing about whether I was doing that correct. I guess he just killed people. That's what he did. But I don't know, man. That seems crazy.
Yeah. Well, okay. I quite like a bit of Russian history. I like it. So the the Bolsheviks seized power in like the 17 revolution, buoyed by Marx. They kind of started to dismantle the self-correcting mechanisms, didn't they? And then Stalin comes to power in the 30s. He's like, oh, that they've done a good job. Let's take it to its most nefarious, evil conclusion. And kind of that crescendos into the collectivism, Soviet farmers, and the kulaks, which was hard reading.
What was the most dangerous job in Russia in 1941?
Oh yeah, that was like KGB, well not KGB, but whatever it was, the precursor to that spy, was it?
Well, even more descriptive than that, being one of Stalin's generals.
Yeah, can you read that thing about how like didn't they all died?
He killed 90% of his generals by 1941.
That's so,
90% of his inner circle was killed by 1941. Yeah, okay, so let's slide this down into secret police and this surveillance network. Again, not being a conversation. This is not a conversation. It's just a capturing of data, right? To power control, right? And this how do you say it? Cartoteki
yeah.
is basically like the Dewey Decimal System for what everyone else is doing, and they put it in a giant filing system to figure out who was doing what and when and how and why. Yeah, and then that eventually leads to a dip back into intersubjective realities created to control populations, right? To control large groups of people. And the super unfortunate story of the kulaks, right? These entrepreneurial, they called them capitalist farmers, but like they kind of had their own farm, they had their own, animals and that sort of thing. And what this surveillance and what this intersubjective reality created by Stalin as this information network, the largest and fastest enslavement campaign in history. This is like the darkest of the dark, dude.
And wasn't that built on the collectionist, where they put the farms together and then, oh, big surprise, people don't actually work as hard when it's not for them and their family and their closest, and so the crops didn't give the bounty that they expected, did they? And so that led on to this, okay, we're going to have to do something about this. On December 27th, 1929, Stalin declared that the Soviet state should seek the liquidation of the kulaks as a class and immediately galvanized the party and secret police to realize that ambitious and murderous aim. And what follows is a very, very short period of genocide.
And in certain areas, certain villages, where actually there was a directive sent down that you had to identify people as kulaks. You had to identify them, even if you didn't have people that fit the definition. So what happened, like, would be a situation where, like, oh, we don't have any in our village, but we got to pick someone or else something's going to happen. So they just picked old people, or just like, hey, sorry, Mark, there's no one that fits that definition in the village. Sorry, dude, I got to put you up. Good luck good luck either not being alive anymore or being in some kind of encampment. Like, wow. Yeah. I mean, learning about this in history, the thing that gets my wheels spinning is that it's not just history and dates and, this happened and that happened, but it's the how these information networks spin up and affect large groups of people, and what type of information network it is. If you look at it as a network, if you look at it as an information network, it's really applicable, and this is what you said earlier, it's really applicable to like where technology is going right now. And technology being literally ones and zeros moving from points to point on networks, and looking at history that way has been, man, pretty eye-opening and a little bit scary.
Agreed. So let's move on to the final part then. As humankind enters the second quarter of the 21st century, a central question is how well democracies and totalitarian regimes will handle both the threats and the opportunities resulting from the current information revolution, aka AI. Will the new technologies favor one type of regime over the other, or will we see the world divided once again, this time by a silicon curtain? How would you corral all of that information from chapter 5 into how you view AI? Just to everyone listening, by the way, we haven't read the rest of the book, so Yuval might give the answers or his opinions on what happens next. We're doing this in real time, so we're just doing it on what chapters 1, 2, 3, 4.
Step by step across each information node.
Because we've got this is our own self-correcting mechanism. We'll self-correct in chapter
in
6,
real
7, 8,
time.
9. Yeah.
In real time. That's a great point. This is the book club is a self-correcting mechanism
Yes.
for our own nutty lack of understanding on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So back to dictatorships and democracies, dictatorships being infallible and broadcasting one way from the inside out, and nothing's coming back here. Well, the stuff that comes back is like the surveillance network, right? So all of these things that come back into the, what do you call it? The how do you say that? The karoteki. So what a bureaucratic nightmare to deal with Dewey Decimal cards, with all that information on people in a manual way and processing all the interconnectivity between that. But what does AI profess to do? What does quantum computing profess to be able to do eventually? And we talked about this with our wonderful guest from X Prize the other day, like how technology can be used for great things that help people in the world and could also use it for nefarious reasons, as we say.
If you had to choose now, just on the spot, do you think that AI lends itself more to North Korea or to little old blighty England? Like, is it a totalitarian thing or is it a democratic technology? Do you think it lends itself more to one or the other? I mean, imagine if Stalin had had AI.
Jeez. Yeah.
Imagine if
Hey, game
Nero.
over. Game over. Like, game over. All right, I'm going to answer that question a little bit differently because I don't think I can say that, AI is more inherently a great fit for democracies or a great fit for terrible dictatorships. The challenge being democracy is these independent nodes that collect and process information, right? And we talked about this. Again, I keep pointing back to this last show, guys. If you haven't listened to the X Prize show yet, please check it out because we talk about empathy. We talk about the human piece involved in technology's use in a good way or a bad way, and also the problems that we create for ourselves, right? So will AI make limit the human element by creating so many shortcuts that we can't think for ourselves anymore? And then democracy becomes in danger because I have so many shortcuts. My shortcuts have turned into beliefs, and I'm not going to listen to you anymore, Mark, because I already have those here, and I'm not going to spend my energy on listening. That's what scares me.
Yeah, and who's creating those shortcuts for you? Who's writing those shortcuts? Who's harvesting them from the internet without due diligence, without critical thinking? Yeah.
Thinking on paper is your own learning your own shortcut by critically thinking and processing and writing and all of that stuff.
They talk about the centralization, the center is infallible. The information all flows from one point, the opposite of decentralization. And AI is essentially putting all the information in one point. All the information will come through one AI, and who has control of that. It doesn't feel like a decentralizing technology necessarily. People talk about the democratization of knowledge, and they use these nonsense terms like AI makes everybody knowledgeable, and it democratizes knowledge and skills. And does it?
Democratizes access to information. I don't think it
And
becomes
as we
knowledge or
prove, information isn't truth, is it? That's like this. The whole
gosh,
book
right?
is that.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm starting to envision, like, if we use our Star Wars analogy, you have, like, could it be, like, that AI is, like, you know, Darth Vader and the dark side and, blockchain is the rebel force on the outside. One wants to get their arms around all of the things and, kinda tweak and manipulate, and the other side is like, "Hey, we wanna create a decentralized approach to this, ownership of all of the little pieces and parts, and remuneration of those pieces and parts once they get used and applied in different ways." Like, I don't know. It's an early riff, but I'm going to sprinkle it out there for now.
I like I'd like to see what's happening in North Korea. I think North Korea is that that will be the experimental. That's the lab, isn't it? Let's see whatever's happening right now with AO, whatever they're doing, would is probably a nice experiment to see where we end up. Because they are, aren't they? I'm sure they are. But it's so secretive, nobody knows anything.
That's the piece. That's the piece. Man, this is guys, how can we end on a high note? How can we turn this thing around, Mark? This is I felt good after the X Prize episode, and I'm feeling a little
Okay, I'll turn around. So everything we said in the last 5 minutes is somewhat not in jest, but it's very easy to go, the world's a bright place and everything's fine. And maybe it is, but you have to think about the flip side. And chapter 5 of the Nexus has just made it blindingly obvious that you have to think about the flip side in order, like, you have to. And it's not being negative and doom. And I love artificial intelligence. I think it's great. Like you said last week, the benefits are unquestionable. But you have to think about the flow. As history has shown, the flow of information doesn't always end up in a good place.
And where's the best place to think? On paper.
On paper.
On paper. All right, well, let's wrap it up. Continue exploring a lot of these threads. There's 4 other chapters, 4 other episodes that you can listen to. If this is the first one you're listening to, pop back in, and it'll add some color and some insight to what we talked about today. Hey, thinking on paper.xyz. Be curious, stay disruptive.
Keep thinking on paper.